What do you do when your homeschool efforts have failed and rebellion seems inevitable? Despite the challenges, Mom, despite the perceived hopelessness, it's not hopeless. Maybe you can reconnect with your child. Maybe you can rebuild trust. And if not you, God can. In my last video, I talked about so many reasons that could lead to your child walking away from the faith. In fact, I gave you some statistics that even though you homeschool, even though you take your child to church every week, even though you're raising them in the faith, even then, homeschool is still not a guarantee. I talked about why. We live in a fallen world. We have an enemy. Many think homeschooling is that guarantee that if I just do this thing, my kids are going to be protected from the world. Maybe you didn't distinguish homeschool from home discipleship. Maybe you are provoking your children to wrath. And I even talked about the father's role in all of this. So many things, you guys. If you did not watch that video, you need to go back and check it out, because there are going to be things in there that I guarantee maybe you haven't thought about and maybe you need to consider. But what if it's happened anyway? The homeschooling experiment has gone terribly wrong. Your child is having doubts. Your child is having struggles with you. What can you do now? I've got news for you, and it's probably not going to be a surprise that maybe this is about you and not about that child. We always want to say, God, fix them. Do something with them. And maybe he's saying, no. This is for you. I want to fix you. So the first thing here is take a step back and take an honest evaluation. In 1 Corinthians 11:31-32, it says, "But if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we're disciplined by the Lord so that we will not be condemned along with the world." So there's two choices here. We can judge ourselves. We can take inventory and we can do something to fix it. Or we can wait for God to step in and intervene, and that might be more painful. Are we perhaps ourselves more consumed with the cares of this life than with the child's heart? Have we neglected our duties there? You know, at the end of the day, everybody's tired, kids are fighting. It is so easy to just tell your kids to go watch TV, or maybe just ignore the fighting, ignore the obvious issues that are going on. It's easy to neglect your Bible study because you're tired. You know, at the end of the day, that's when it's time for Dad to come in, if he's not doing it at any other time in the day, that is. But your family Bible study, like as homeschool moms, I know many of us are doing Bible study with our kids, but what about Dad? Is Dad involved? I heard a sermon from Paul Washer once, and I don't remember what sermon this is from because I've heard so many of them, but he talked about, and I think he was exhorting fathers in this, but moms, there's pertinent exhortation here for you as well. But he talked about how when he comes home and his wife is frazzled because she's been with the kids all day and the kids were not getting along with each other and she's just at her wit's end. Well, he's had a long day too. He missed his family. He just wanted to come home and just have everybody throw their arms around him and say, "Daddy, welcome home," and everything just be peaceful and blissful, so that the king can sit in his chair and relax from a long day or a long week's worth of work. And oftentimes husbands, that's what they do when they come home from work. They think it's the end of the day and their job is done. And he said, "No, men, that is when your job is just beginning. Do not abandon your wife to the duties that are yours." Wives, this could be difficult because, you know, your husband may not be the one watching this video, right? And you may say like, "Yes, I want my husband to lead," but he's not. Then wives, you're going to just have to pray and ask God to be your strength. He's going to be more faithful, and he's going to give you more strength and energy and support than your husband could, especially in a situation like this when maybe you are being neglected and your husband is abdicating that role to you. Pray for your husband. And unfortunately, wives, you can't neglect your children because your husband is neglecting you. the battle is never going to stop. The battle for the hearts and minds of our children is more important than our physical fatigue. And this stage is just a season. So it's hard and it's difficult, but remind yourself this is a season, and pray for strength and pray that God use your conduct to change your husband. That's something that 1st or 2nd Peter, I can't remember what verse it is, but it says, wives, let your conduct be in such a way that your husband can be won over without a word spoken from you, just by watching you. Another thing you can do when taking an honest evaluation is ask your spouse. Maybe your spouse sees things going on that you don't see. I know my husband has often told me things about what he's noticed between the interactions between me and one or several of my children. Maybe he has a perception of how I'm treating one versus how I'm treating another, because he's brought up to me that I'm harder and more consistently disciplined with one than I am with another. When maybe they misbehave, I'm a little bit more loosey-goosey with them. And those are things that I didn't see until he pointed out that to me. But the kids often do see it. In fact, I have one child who will very often point out if they see little injustices like that happening. So my husband sent me this because he ran across this on social media, and I actually found it interesting. It really goes along with this in taking inventory, because in the last video I mentioned how maybe one of the stumbling blocks that we put in front of our kids is provoking them to wrath. And as part of that, because I gave so many ways we can do that, you guys, if you haven't watched that video, you really should, because there are things that you just don't always consider. But as part of one of the ways that we can provoke our children to wrath is if we are always criticizing them without the praise, without encouraging them also. Or maybe we're just like so nitpicky about the smallest little thing. So here's an example of that. Visionary Family Ministries wrote, our daughter told us if all the positive feedback a teen receives is outside the home and all the negative feedback they receive is in the home, eventually they have the daily thought, I don't want to be at home anymore. Have we ourselves contributed to the stumbling block that our children are falling over? What do I mean by that? I think that I see a lot. I've seen it in a lot of people that I know, and maybe not my immediate family now, but my family growing up and my extended family. This was a problem that I have seen has had devastating effects on faith, and that is the idol of sports. I have just very strong conviction when I had kids that because of what I knew many of my friends and families struggled with, making sports an idol. And what I mean by that is if a sports competition is ever in competition with church, sports is always chosen. Because you can't miss a game. You can't miss a practice. But God understands if you miss over here. And when you look at eternity, what does God care about these games? What are we teaching our kids when we're signing them up for hours and hours and spending exorbitant amounts of money for them to perfect this skill while neglecting training them to be a disciple for Christ? We're signing them up to miss church services on so many weekends so that they can travel with their sports team. And we justify it by saying, oh, well, we can listen to a church sermon anywhere. God is everywhere. Well, that's true. And I think there's grace for things like going on vacation or going to visit family who's out of town and you have to miss a church service. But this just seems like when you start going down that road, whenever sports is in conflict with church, sports gets chosen every time. And what are we teaching our kids then? And then why are we surprised that when they grow up, they're not faithful to church? Faithfulness to a local church, to a local body of believers is so important. I could sit at home and listen to John MacArthur sermons and say, well, that's my church. But God created the body of Christ for a reason, because they know you. They know your weaknesses. We need friends like that. We need people who know us so that they can see without us saying something's wrong. We need ministers or church leaders who can come alongside and help and counsel. And if we keep ourselves from those relationships and we keep all of those church people at an arm's length distance, what we're really doing is saying, I don't want to be accountable to anybody. And that's what we're teaching our kids too. You know, are we becoming a law to ourselves? And I'm not saying that sports are evil and all sports are bad and you should never sign your kids up for sports. What I'm saying is sports has a place and it should not be a prominent place. My kids play sports. My daughters play volleyball, rec leagues. My son plays summer baseball. But if there's a game on a Wednesday night, we go to church. If there's a practice that happens to fall during even a church fellowship, even if it's not a regular church service, but it's a time like a prayer meeting or a time where our church friends had asked us to have fellowship with them, we're going to choose that first, because I'm training my children that we're not on this earth to serve ourselves. We're on this earth to represent Christ and to honor him in all things, and sports are just a game. Because of what I went through as in my childhood and things that I saw with people that where sports just became so important, they ruined relationships over sports. I could tell you stories about how sports have affected me because of other people. It can be an idol, and it's something that could become a stumbling block to your own child's faith. Are they going to serve God? Or are they going to serve sports? And I'm talking about sports because sports is the one that I am most familiar with in my family, my extended family. That seems to be our crutch. That seems just like certain people are prone to alcoholism. My family is prone to sports idolatry, so I've been very aware of it. But you could replace sports with any club. You could replace it with drama. All of a sudden, make you too busy so that you can't be faithful to a local church anymore. You know, it could be NCFCA, it could be a robotics club, anything that's meant to be added onto your life, not for your life to revolve around it, and then you just squeeze Jesus in whenever it's convenient, whenever he fits into your schedule, and he'll understand. Our life should be consumed with him. Like those verses in Deuteronomy where it's talking about teaching them diligently, and you talk about God when you're walking and when you're lying down, and it's on the frontlets of your head, which meaning every decision that you make, you should be asking, is this pushing forward the purposes of God and furthering the gospel and not becoming a stumbling block to my child's faith? Anyway, that's going to probably hit a nerve with some people. And then this is a big one. Taking an honest evaluation of what's happening in your home. And this one has nothing to do with homeschool, you guys, and it has nothing to do with even your child. But what is going on in your marriage? Because that is more important to take care of before what's going on with you and your child. What's going on in your marriage could be that stumbling block that is causing your child to lose faith. So in my last video, I kind of touched on the father abdicating his roles over to the wife and just letting her handle it. Well, what about the wife? Maybe not submitting to her husband or not respecting her husband. What are the children being taught here? I mentioned that book by Vodi Bakum, What He Must Be to Marry My Daughter. And in that book, he talked about marriage being a ministry. Marriage is a ministry to your children. It's a ministry to others because it is a picture of the relationship between Christ and his church. Christ as the head, which is what the husband represents, and the wife is the church, submitting to Christ and the head. Husbands, you are to love your wife as your own body. You are to put her needs above yours, just as Christ did for the church. And wives, you are to see to it that you respect your husband, submit. And the Bible even talks about even if your husband isn't obeying. I mentioned that verse about the husband being won over by the conduct of the wife. Even if your husband isn't fulfilling his duties, which, he might not, because he's not Jesus. Who are we serving? I am working for God's well done to me, for him to say, well done, Rachel. If my husband says thank you, that's wonderful. But I am doing things around the home for my husband or for my children because they need to be done. And because this is my duty as a wife. I'm not being responsible in my duties because I think that I'm going to get a thank you, or I think I'm going to get this or that or the other thing. I'm doing it to honor my family and to honor the Lord. I have a friend. She's a wonderful Christian now, but she started rebelling when she was a teenager and I don't know how faithful her family was to church back then because I didn't know her that well. Her family, meaning her parents, are definitely faithful Christians now. I think they were younger Christians when she was a child and they were growing. But she started to rebel, late teens into her 20s, and even fell in the drugs and even went to jail until she got saved. But what she would say was the thing that affected her the most when she began to rebel was her parents arguing with each other all the time. And maybe she couldn't express it back then, but if the parents' marriage is falling apart, and this is the picture of Christ in the church, and it's broken, this is what we're teaching our kids about Christ. That broken picture made her question everything she was being told because it wasn't working practically. She wasn't seeing it. I don't know who said this. My dad likes to quote this all the time. And it's a biblical principle, but he says, your actions are speaking so loudly, I can't hear a word you're saying. The constant bickering and the constant arguing of her parents made her lose respect for her parents, made her question everything she was being told about Christ, and made her go run after something else that could fulfill her, which ended up just being a dark, dark road. Children are already insecure, and their home is supposed to be their safe place. Are we creating that for them? I know another young lady who had a similar situation where she began rebelling as a teenager and a young adult. She told me the same thing, like there was such instability in her home and such an underlying wave of tension that she never wanted to invite friends over. She wanted to get out. She could not wait to get out of her parents' home. So take inventory of your marriage. And if there are issues in your marriage, take care of those first. And maybe that will be a testimony to your child. Repent and apologize if we've been wrong. Our children need to see this modeled. They need to see a contrite heart. Christ is able to redeem. He's able to overcome. And he says in Romans 8, because of what he did for us, we will overwhelmingly conquer. Overwhelmingly, we have that power in us, but we can only change what we can control. In your marriage, that's you. You can't even control your spouse. If your spouse wants to fix things in your marriage, that is wonderful. That is not every situation. In fact, I would venture to say that's probably not the majority of situations. It may just be one person who humbles themselves and says, you know what, despite how I am being wronged, I am going to do this because this is what God asks me to do, and I'm going to travel down this lonely road, and I'm going to let God work. I'm going to lean on those verses in 1 Peter that say that the husband can be won by the conversation of the wife. And husband's the same thing. The wife could be won by your changed behavior. In 1 John, it says, we love him because he first loved us. There wasn't this mutual coming together. Oh, Christ loved us because we decided to love him and we came together at the same time. I am so unfaithful to God. All the time. I sin every single day. And he is still faithful to me despite how unfaithful I am to him. That is how we are to treat our spouses. We might have to love and love and love without being loved back. Isn't that what love is? Laying down our life. That's a real agape love, which is the highest form of love because it is self-sacrificing. I was recommended this sermon once, and it is one of the best Bodhi sermons that I've ever heard. I've listened to it multiple times. Every married person should listen to the sermon. In fact, whenever I go to a wedding shower, I always give the bride-to-be this sermon, and I say, look it up, listen to it. And if you search for it, it's called Forgiveness by Bodhi. And one of the things that he talks about in that sermon is forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. And often we confuse the two because we think in order to forgive that the person needs to apologize and maybe they haven't apologized or they haven't changed. Okay. He distinguishes these two because he says forgiveness is not making that person pay for their sin. Reconciliation is when you come together and maybe both sides should confess and apology. And, that's often what we're like. We're not going to forgive until we reconcile. But that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is you don't need an apology. You forgive. You treat that person with dignity. You don't withhold yourself from them. You don't, give them the cold shoulder whenever they try to speak to you. That's making them pay for it. You might have to take on this hurt. The first time I ever listened to that sermon was when my husband and I were struggling with forgiveness. And it hit me like a ton of bricks because I wanted reconciliation. I wanted to hear an apology for specific things. I wanted to see the changed behavior. I wanted that part. And until I got that, I wasn't willing to forgive. But God forgives us. He doesn't make us pay for our sin. If you go look it up and listen to it, make sure you leave me a comment below and let me know. It is seriously one of the best. So keep asking God for mercy. Keep asking him what you're supposed to do. Your spouse is on their own journey. God's going to have to reach them differently. God's going to have to reach your child in their own special way. What does he want from you? Don't overreact to your child if there is a stress factor, if there's something going on here. Maybe you need to just step back and give them room to grow. Maybe you need to it's time to zip it, right? Maybe it's time for you to just let them make their mistakes and you be there. When they realize they're making mistakes and they come back for support, you be there to support them. You be there to love them and to guide them. You also need to ask yourself, are they really doing something wrong or are they just doing something different than what we would do? That hits me. Those of us who like things a certain way and who are responsible and organized, and we would like for our children to just listen to everything that we say because we're trying to protect them, but they're not always going to do that. And maybe we want them to do things a certain way because we think it will avoid a catastrophe. But what they're actually doing is just different than how you would do it. And they're not actually in a catastrophe yet. Sometimes they got to figure things out on their own. Trials build faith. Sometimes they need some trials. Did they cross God's word or just my own personal convictions? We can freak out way too much just because our kids want to do it a different way. And cry out for restoration. God can restore. He's told Israel this so many times, specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 30. If you return to me, and if you obey in accordance with everything I'm commanding you today, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity with compassion, and he will gather you again to himself from where he scattered you. Parents, maybe this is for you. Maybe there is something in us that we need to do that God has taken and scattered our children away from us because he's trying to get at us. And maybe when we obey, he will bring those children back. Pray for that. What would he have us to do? Pray for restoration. Job is the poster child for restoration, and Job didn't even do anything wrong, right? But when Job lost everything, he lost all of his riches, all of his possessions, and his family. In the end, Job got restored plus some, plus additional blessings. And Job himself, because again, trials are to work faith in us. At the end of Job's trial, he said, Lord, I knew you before, but now I really know you. David, numbering the people, which God said, do not do. It's not needed. Like, trust me. David did it anyway. And the death angel was coming. God sent a plague. People were dying until finally David made an offering and said, God, I'm sorry. This is my fault. God is slow to anger, but he is quick to forgive when we turn to him. David's blunder became one of his biggest testimonies. We don't homeschool our kids for pragmatic results. At least I don't. I'm not just homeschooling my kids for academic results. I'm not homeschooling my kids because I'm so fearful of the world. I mean, I don't want them exposed to it, but I'm not so fearful of the world. I'm not ignorant. I know that I can't keep the world out. I'm homeschooling my kids out of obedience to God. When he says, these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall repeat them diligently to your sons, and speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. You shall also tie them as a sign to your hand, and they shall be as frontlets on your forehead. And you shall also write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Everybody who enters your home should be able to see who you serve. God's saying, obey me and then trust me. Evaluate your own self and your own responsibilities. You take care of that first. And then you take care of your marriage. You make sure that's strong for your children. And you teach them diligently. And you point them to me through my word. And I'll do the rest. And friends, he can do a far more effective job in reaching the hearts of my children than I can. So if you missed my first video, catch it right here. More videos like this in this playlist. Biblical encouragement for homeschooling moms and dads. Until next time, bye.